Well, good evening and welcome again to the Harbor Table program of the Tony Woiak History Festival. And it's so wonderful to see so many people here again tonight. We've had a wonderful attendance for both the first and second events of this season. And I'm just kind of curious, can I have a show of hands for someone who's been to at least one of the other two that we just had? Yeah, look at that. And has anybody been to all three then? Excellent. Okay, good job.
So tell us who Tony Woiak is.
Tony Woiak, okay, I'm going to give you a hint, because we have, once in a while somebody will say, well, who is this Tony Woiak guy? So we've described it in our newsletter. If you get the newsletter, you might have read about Tony Woiak. Or if you're from Washburn, you might already know about Tony Woiak. But if you don't, we should let you know from time to time. But here's my idea. We're all neighbors, right? So raise your hand again if you do know who Tony Woiak is. Okay, so if you keep your hands up a second. So if you don't know who Tony Woiak is, I think a nice friendly thing to do might be to find somebody who just had their hand up. And if you did have your hand up and you're sitting next to somebody that didn't have their hand up, share the idea a little bit, but I promise I'll tell about it next time. How's that? That gives us a chance to get acquainted. Okay. So tonight, before we begin with our speaker, I have some thanks and appreciations. First of all, to the Harbor Table, who's been such a great host to us and helped us out with setting up the chairs and getting things organized. I also want to thank the Community Education Foundation, which has given us money this year in a grant that has really improved our sound and visual system. So I appreciate them, and let's give them a round of applause, please. Thank you. And thank you to you all for being here tonight. I'm introducing a young man that I heard of. I think it was David Bradley that said, we need to get somebody to talk to us about the trails, and he had seen somebody give us a talk about trails, and I don't know, one thing led to another, and we got Amorin's name, and I met with Amorin last summer, and he wasn't sure that you would be real interested. He said, I'm mostly interested in history that goes back like before Washburn, like way before Washburn. His like pre-1860, and I said, well, then you're actually going to talk in a good series, because the speaker that we had last time talked about glaciers. So that goes way back too, Amorin. And so, and I said, plus I said, our audience is just, they come because they're interested and curious themselves. And I knew there would be a good match here. But Amorin is from the area. He grew up in Bayfield County, and he is right now employed as a paralegal land specialist in the legal department of the Red Cliff Band over in Red Cliff. And he lives in Washburn. He started his educational experience at the McMaster University in Ontario. And then he didn't finish his degree there. He wound up in Superior and finished his degree at the university there. Since his graduation, he has worked in a diverse range of experiences with environmental issues and solutions. And then some of the places he's worked are California, Nevada, Colorado, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Vermont, Ontario, Costa Rica, and Wisconsin. Wow. So he's been around. And the other thing I wanted to mention about him is when we met, I was impressed by the fact that he had worked so hard to do the research that he's already done. And I believe he's done that just out of a great curiosity. He seemed to me to be really questioning about what he wanted to learn about the past. So I'll let him do some more introductions, but right now, please help me welcome Amorin Mello.
Thank you, Jenny. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah? Turn it up? Up. Test, 1, 2. Can everybody in the back hear me okay? Okay, great, awesome. Thank you. I want to thank the Washburn Heritage Association for inviting me for this opportunity. Doing a talk about pre-Washburn is something I've thought about doing for a few years now, and it was really excellent to get the invitation to do that. So I want to thank the Washburn Heritage Association for this opportunity. And I also wanted to thank the late Norma Sulier, who was the Bad River librarian for many years. She introduced me to a lot of the things I'll be talking about tonight. So I want to thank her for all the knowledge that she passed on. I want to quickly introduce myself. Ginny did a great job. About 10 years ago, I started mapping out ancient trail networks that were on the original General Land Office records of this area from the 1850s. And you can see on the left this map with the trail systems. There's quite a few in this area that focus around the Lake Superior Basin and will cross over down into the Mississippi Basin, Mississippi River Basin. For the most part, today I'll be talking about the Great Trail that goes from the St. Croix River up to the Bayfield, Washburn area. I got into this history research because I was originally searching for old land records in the Pinocchio Mountains, tribal land records, and the hobby kind of grew from the mountain range into the Tri-County area. And about 2015, I joined a history blog called The Swamping in History, and it focuses on local history from before 1860. Kind of a arbitrary date, but the date represents, in my mind, a pretty powerful shift from a tribal landscape into an American landscape. It's not an exact date, but it's just a point of reference. I'll be talking about quite a few things tonight. You might have seen a few of the topics on my first slide here. 5 different topics I kind of want to pass on after today's talk. But there are 2 main concepts that are historical vocabulary, and maybe it would be helpful if I talked about them ahead of time. One is the paper town concept, where when this was still the wild Northwest, land was just being acquired by the United States and being opened up for sale to settlers and farmers and miners. People would create these towns on paper, recording at the land office, and start selling shares and town lots before there was ever even a road or any kind of infrastructure in the area. So sometimes it would be a great investment, and sometimes it would be a scam. Sometimes it just didn't work out. But the paper town concept is talking about a concept of a village or a town or a city that can become a reality someday, but at the time it wasn't a reality yet. So that's what I mean by a paper town. The other concept I want to help communicate ahead of time is the mixed blood concept. And mixed blood, there are worse ways to say mixed blood, and I won't get into those other words, but what this is referring to is the language in the 1854 treaty, where there was a specific class of people who weren't quite Indian, they weren't quite white, they were somewhere in the middle. And they had their own specific privileges and rights under the treaty language. So that's what I'm referring to when I say mixed blood. Today, it can be interchangeable with just tribal. Nobody really says mixed blood anymore, it's just tribal. If you want to learn more about these 2 concepts, I highly recommend these 2 books. The first one is The Future City on the Inland Sea, A History of Imaginative Geographies of Lake Superior. And it focuses specifically on the Swamping Bay area. The other book I highly recommend is called Our Relation to Mixed Blood, indigenous transformation and dispossession in the Western Great Lakes, and specifically about the Pinocchio Mountain area that I was just talking about. A professor at UW-Madison had seen a map that I made, the lower right map here, and it eventually snowballed into a whole book about that topic because it's something that hasn't really been covered in American history or local history before, and it's a really important topic to have moving forward. So, with that being said, I want to introduce you to what we call the Great Trail. Henry Schoolcraft had drawn it out from Sioux River going southwest into the St. Croix country. He called it the Great Trail, and he did a very simplified version of the Great Trail on his map. But if you compare it to the actual trails that existed at the time, you can see that there's more than just one great trail going to the Washburn area. You could take the trail that went from the Barrens to Spindley Valley Road to Sioux River, or you could take this other branch that would follow more along the Fish River, Fish Creek. You could either take the north side of Fish Creek or the south side of Fish Creek. And there were multiple trailheads along Flanagan Bay, but they all are what I would call the Great Trail. Just a very simplified version, simplified way of referring to the same trail network. And where do these trails go here? Well, if you look at the original Washburn boundary that's highlighted in yellow, you can see that there are multiple trail systems inside the original town of Washburn. In fact, it appears that Washburn is actually centered on this trail network. There were 4 main hubs that were here. One was at the Sioux River, another one was at Fish Creek, another one was in Moose Lake, which is part of the Barrens, and then another one by Loon Lake, just outside of Iron River, which is also part of the Barrens. So when these trails would go to each other, but also you could take them to go north to La Pointe and Redcliffe and the South Shore. You could take them to the east to go to Bad River and Michigan and beyond. You could take them to the west to Iron River and Superior and beyond. Or you could take them south across the Great Divide into the Mississippi River Basin by following the Namaquacan River to the St. Croix River to the Mississippi River, all the way down to Louisiana if you wanted to. Let's see. Why these trails were here is because they were part of an ancient trail network that went from the Mississippi River to Lake Superior. They followed something called the Northwest Sands of Lake Superior, of Wisconsin, and this is actually a glacial deposit that was started about 10,000 years ago. As the glaciers were melting, they started dumping sand into this long stretch of belt of sand about 150 miles long from St. Clair Falls all the way to Bayfield area. And it's a long stretch, it's a narrow stretch, so it's a very distinct landscape that people would follow as they were crossing the landscape. And they've used the trail network for thousands of years. It's a very diverse ecosystem. You can get a lot of natural resources from that area, berries, game, plants, so on and so forth. It was a very important landscape for the tribe, something that we call today a traditional cultural property. And as people traveled the trails for thousands of years, they found the fastest way or the easiest way to get from point A to point B. If you do the same walk over and over again, you're going to learn a few shortcuts to make it easier next time. And to get from, if you wanted to get from La Pointe into the Barrens, go down to the St. Croix River, there are 2 main ways that you can do that. One is to start at Pike Creek, go up the hill, follow the trail along the yellow line. You can see this red line representing the original trail network. But as people started doing, in today's age, as people started modeling the trail network and doing GIS, trying to find the path of least resistance to get from the lake onto the trail network, they actually found that going along the Sioux River is quicker and easier. So we have 2 different options to get to the same place in the Barrens, and the easiest way to do that, 2 easy ways to do it, one is a little easier than the other, either through Pike Creek or through the Sioux River. And that's kind of an abstract, going a little bit more into detail of the trail network than I need to. I want to back up a little bit and explain why I'm focusing on Washburn before 1883. The best way I can do that is by repeating a quote that I find in a lot of history sources about Washburn. And it comes from the 1892 Ashland Press, where they say, "There are no romances of Indian lore in the history of its foundation. No poetical inspiration can be derived from its early history. When Washburn was platted, it was strictly a business consideration, and it has been a matter of business ever since." Now, this language was pretty common for that time in 1892. You have to remember that it's a time of manifest destiny in American history, where the goal was to take over the landscape, use the natural resources, populate the landscape, and forget about what had happened, who was here before. Now, this language about Washburn is not just a one-time publication. It's been repeated over and over the generations. You can still find this exact quote on the signage along the Lakeshore Trail. In fact, it's on the City of Washburn website as well. If you look at the Washburn history, and I'm not trying to single out any historians here saying this is a bad way of looking at history, but it's a very whitewashed way of looking at history. Because Washburn history seems to jump from the French Jesuits being here in the 1600s to after 1883, after the railroad was already here, after the city was already here. There's a huge gap of information and knowledge that's being overlooked. So this is why I'm focusing on Washburn before 1883, to remember the people that were here and still are here. If you look at the pre-1854 treaty landscape, there were a number of settlements that were already here around the time of the 1854 treaty and of the first land surveys in 1855, the following year. I've identified like 3 different clusters there along the lakeshore, one being at Sioux River, one being here in Washburn, the other one being down by Buckdale, and then there's the St. Croix Bayfield Trail Network as well. So there were a number of not only villages and church camps, fields, prairies, wetlands, marshes, lakes, and rivers, but there were already roads and homes and settlements as well. Some of them had names, like Butterfield, Banventer, so on and so forth. And when I look into the National Archives deep enough, I find when they were proposing reservations to be here in terms of the 1854 treaty, apparently there was something called the Point of Rocks Reservation located at Houghton Point area. I have not been able to find much more information about the specific map or that specific name, but I found corresponding information about the concept that I'll talk about a little bit more. If you're not familiar with the treaty or reservations or allotments, I should quickly explain that 1854 treaty reserved and withheld land from sale for the benefit of the tribe. It was supposed to be held in trust for the tribe moving forward, so that way they would have a permanent homeland, a permanent place to live for the next generation to come. And then allotments are where you break up a reservation into smaller pieces for individual families. So there's a huge, big reservation, smaller allotments, and it's part of the 1854 treaty language, specifically from Article 2, which the United States agreed to set apart and withhold from sale for the use of the shipyards of Lake Superior. So the Point of Rock Reservation was apparently part of the language that set aside land for the La Pointe Band. There's a specific language in the second clause of the second article where it talks about, it's describing the Battle River Reservation, La Pointe Reservation as it's called at the time, where it goes over 1 mile, and then up to the lakeshore, and apparently across the lakeshore to Swamingen Point. Swamingen Point is where that laser point is pointing, and then Point of Rocks would actually be where what we call Houghton Point today. I don't know if this was just a different interpretation of crossing Swamingen Point. I really would like to learn more about this, and if anybody else has more information about this, please share. I would like to learn more. But it's not just a map. I was able to map out the allotments that were in the Washburn area before, including 160 acres here in the city of Washburn itself. And I explained what the allotments were. I'm not going to get too much into detail about any of all these families that are listed here. I will talk about Peter Vandeventer a little bit more, and he's the one that has an allotment on pretty much Highway 13 in Washburn. So around that same time, in 1854, 1855, 1856, there were a couple of brothers that lived here, the Barber brothers, Joe Allen Barber and his older brother, Augustus Barber. They were U.S. General Land Surveyors working for the United States. They were doing the first land surveys for the General Land Office to break down each square mile into smaller pieces, that way they could be sold for public land auctions. And not only were they working for the government, but they were also working for themselves. They were pretty savvy, they had a lot of connections in the area, they had the power to make people millionaires by being able to scout the land, let people know where the resources were, let them know where future city sites would be a good idea. And they even started a couple of themselves. But Augustus Barber unfortunately died here in the area, in the Montreal River, Pinocchio Mountains area, around 1856 in April. And this is the last known letter from Augustus Barber, where he's talking about a conspiracy of people trying to start paper towns, of having knives and guns, and there's going to be possibly some killing, for sure some laming, and they better not mess with my clan. And a few days after he wrote this letter, he ends up dead under mysterious circumstances. Which is especially tragic for his family, because his brother was living here at the time, and their father was on his way from Vermont to visit them and help them, give them some guidance with their paper towns. But by the time the father had shown up, Augustus had passed away, and he had to help deal with the tragedy and the aftermath and help take care of his other son. His other son, Joe Allen Barber, right after his brother had passed away, a few months later, he was elected surveyor for the county of LaPointe. He was awarded the government contract to survey the Bad River Reservation, and he was perhaps even more powerful than he was before his brother had passed away. He had a lot of influence in the area, and he had an important job to do here. Not only for the settlers, but also the tribes and the local government. But the letter ends by saying, I would not like to have this known, it might cause me a little difficulty. So not everything was on the up and up, even though he was in that highly respected position. And right after he had been elected, the other business partner, Albert McEwen, had also passed away under mysterious circumstances, murder. This was a very unusual time for that family, for this area, where you have people trying to start town sites, having life and death situations, and living with the consequences. So the father, Giles, he helps his son Joe Allen Barber deal with his brother's passing, helps him with local politics and investment, and goes back to Vermont and continues to write to his son to check up on him, make sure he's still alive, make sure he's not losing money, passing on advice, saying, hey, I learned this from the local, from the national newspapers about town sites. Here's what you should do to help follow the law as best as you can and manipulate the law as best as you can. It's very interesting to read through these letters, and I'm not going to get into all of them tonight. That's another story for another day. But this was a very wild time in the wild, wild Northwest. I always wonder, what if there weren't these murders? What if Augustus was still around? What if Albert was still around? What if the town sites were still around? Well, even if they had stayed alive, the town sites may not have survived because right after all this was the financial panic of 1857, where nationwide banks were collapsing, investments were failing. It was followed by the American Civil War, and the Northwood became very quiet after 1850s. It was very quiet during the 1860s, started coming back to life in the 1870s. During the logging era, and then when the railroad came in the 1880s, it became more and more populated, and eventually Washburn comes around. So the Panic of '57 caused a lot of commotion in this area, caused a lot of investments to fail. So even if the Barbers stayed alive and the friends stayed alive, they may have not succeeded after all. But I don't want to get into this conspiracy too much. I'd rather just look at the records. I don't want to look at the facts and just help move this along. So, where were the town sites before 1883? There were 5 main clusters in the Washburn area. I'll talk about them in a clockwise fashion. The first one I'll talk about is that Sioux River, and then I'll talk about Houghton Point. I'll talk about Vanderventer Bay after that. I'll talk about Boyd Creek following that, and then finally I'll go up to the Barrens in kind of a clockwise fashion. So, Sioux River. First thing I want to talk about Sioux River is that you may notice on some maps and some sources, they refer to Sioux River as Raspberry River as well. Now, I believe this is probably a historical mistake that's just been passed on over the generations, and I tried to find the origin for this mistake and why it happened. I think why it happened was because of the 1820 Cass expedition, where Governor Cass had come from Michigan through the Lake Superior area. He went along the lake shore, went up the Long Island to La Pointe, stayed at La Pointe for a little bit, and then kept going north to Raspberry Bay, Sandy Bay, and then Fond du Lac as well. And this map that's drawn by Henry Schoolcraft, kind of a cartoon. It's not really intended to be accurate at all. So when Henry Bayfield came a few years later and did an accurate survey of Swampscott Bay area, of the Bayfield Peninsula, he drew the rivers where they should be, he drew the landscape where it should be, but he didn't label any of the rivers. So I think what happened, as time went on, people saw the better map, and they looked at where Schoolcraft had put Raspberry. So Raspberry should actually be here, Sioux River should be down here, but they kind of got combined in together. So Raspberry River is labeled where it should be Sioux River. Raspberry River is actually up here somewhere. So that's why, in my opinion, the Raspberry misnomer has been passed on over time. The kind of a history quick, I won't talk about that much more other than that. You may see on these maps Raspberry River, and I'm trying to explain why it's called Raspberry River and not Sioux River sometimes. Next, I want to talk about paper railroads a little bit that were proposed to go to Sioux River. They were actually following some of the original trails. There was going to be an intersection in the Barrens and go to the place called Bayfield on this map, but it's actually located at the Raspberry River. As time went on, and real railroads started showing up on the landscape, they stopped putting this paper railroad here, and they only put the real railroads where they were supposed to be, and the real trails where they were supposed to be. And I noticed on these maps that we have Bayfield at Sioux River, then we have Bayfield at Sioux River, but there's upper Bayfield where Bayfield should be. Then eventually in the 1870s, we have Bayfield where it should be, and then lower Bayfield at Sioux River. And I just think that's fascinating. And there's other maps out there that show lower Bayfield or other references to lower Bayfield. I'd be interested in collecting those. Please share if you have them. You might see on these maps that we have Butterfield where Washburn should be. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's see here. The oldest land record I can find for the Washburn area is from 1855. That was filed in La Pointe County Book of Deeds A. And it was filed by Francis McElroy, who put a claim at a meadow on a on a meadow on the Sioux River that was formerly occupied by the American Fur Company. I have not found any older American Fur Company record to this, so there may actually be an older record than this that would refer to the Sioux River. I just haven't found it yet. So June 12, 1855, it's the oldest land record I know of in the Washburn area, and also the oldest record I know of referring to Sioux River as the name Sioux River. But at the time, by 1855, he had built a house on it, had cultivated part of it, had a farm going, and was here to stay for a while. A couple months after that, Augustus Barber and his brother Joe Allen Barber, they're doing the land surveys. They go to the same place. They noticed that the mill site that McEwen had talked about, McElroy had talked about, they recognized that same mill site. They said that yes, it's a great mill site, it's a great place on the lake shore. They didn't talk about McEwen himself, but they're obviously talking about the same improvements and the same resources. And he also refers to it as Sioux River just a little bit after McElroy. So they're in second place for the name. Let's see. So, Joe Allen Barber, after his brother Augustus had passed away, he's still in the area doing those surveys for the federal government, for the county government, for the tribal governments. And he describes in his letters to home going to the Sioux River, doing some survey work for McElroy. He's also talking about another family called the Maddox at Houghton, and he's talking about the new sawmill outside of Houghton. And these are some of the place names that were still shown on maps from the 1870s, about 2 decades afterwards. You got the 3 sites. You also have Vanderventer as well, and we'll talk about him again later. So, McElroy had filed the land claim in 1855, and then eventually in 1858, he was able to buy 80 acres for his land claim from the United States government after the survey was done by the Barber brothers. And a few years later, he also had another claim. He also bought another property on what's now Kajarvik Road, I believe. So I believe the mill site, the meadow, was probably in the 1858 site. And then I'm not sure why he bought this other property. I would have to do a little bit more research to find that out. But when we are referring to the mill site on the Sioux River, it's referring to this one. You can see this is Friendly Valley Road, and you can see this is the Great Trail. So Friendly Valley Road is actually one of the trailheads for the Great Trail. And this map is actually labeled as a road by 1855. So it was already well established at the time of the treaty. And it remained a well-established place for the following decades. So by the time we come to the 1870s, shortly before Washburn shows up, it's still called the McElroy Farm, but it's actually operated by other people. And it's pretty much a resort that people would go to. When they're traveling from the St. Croix country, from the Mississippi River country, they were looking forward to a place called McElroy, where they could go fishing, could have great food, you could explore the landscape, the climate's nice, the people are nice, it's just a pleasant place to be. Maybe that's why they call it Friendly Valley Road, not really sure. So, the next place I'm going to go to is Houghton Point. We're just going to walk down the lake shore, just a little further south. And I want to talk about some of the oldest names I've been able to find for Houghton Point. Before Houghton Point was Houghton Point, there was Cold Point on these maps. I found it on maps from the 1820s, 1830s, it's probably on the 1840 map, and then also 1850s as well. I have not found the original source for this name. I'm not sure whose journal it may have come from. Maybe it's a reference from the Cass expedition of 1920. Maybe it's from a different source. If anybody knows, please let me know. I've been looking hard for the original source for this name. But another common name that was used before Houghton Point was Stony Point. And we have this court record from 1856 where Skinaway is describing the last time he saw a man before he passed away, before the man passed away. And in the court records, he's talking about Stony Point. Oh, I was going by Stony Point, and I looked it over, and the last time I saw him, he was still on the ice, still walking. He hadn't passed away yet. So this is an official court record where a tribal member is talking about the place called Stony Point. And it's not the tribal members that called it that, but also prominent figures in American history had talked about Stony Point as well. Increase LaFamme, he's a pretty famous Wisconsinite, also known as an American author, scientist, and naturalist. He came up here in 1858 to investigate the Pinocchio mining activities that were happening at the time. In order to get there, he would go from La Point down the lake shore to Ashland and start taking another trail network that would go on what's called the Pinocchio Road to the Pinocchio Mountains. But in order to get there, he had to go by Stony Point. And he writes about this in his journal, his diary, his geology diary. At Stony Point, where there is a paper town called Houghton, just one house and a sawmill. So when people talk about paper town, usually was just one house, if they were lucky. And a house is pretty subjective. It might just be a pile of sticks and call it good. I just want to show what Houghton would have looked like at the time. When people think of Houghton Point, they probably think of their little area in red here, where it's just a little canyon, you have echo dells, you can walk through it, you see Houghton Falls. It's a beautiful, beautiful landscape, just a tiny little canyon that goes out into the river, into the lake. But the city, the town of Houghton, was much larger than just this little echo dell area. And they had three main agents that were promoting the town. One of them was Asa Maddox, who lived in Houghton, who's the house that they were talking about. There was an agent in Washington, D.C., Charles Tucker, who was promoting the town of Houghton on a national scale. And then there was another gentleman called Frederick Prentice, who many people probably recognize, Frederick Prentice, who lived in Toledo, Ohio. So not only was Maddox pushing the town of Houghton up here, but people were pushing it in Ohio and then in D.C. as well. You can probably find land records or deeds recorded for the town of Houghton that were recorded in Ohio and in D.C. So if someone really wanted to research the history of Houghton, they have to do some traveling and a lot of digging in order to make sure that they found everything. And that's a little after my area of my time period of interest. It's probably after 1860s. So I will volunteer someone else to do that research for us instead. As I mentioned before, Giles Barber, after his son Augustus died, Joel Allen's still here, he's been elected, he's doing all this important survey work. He's writing back to his son, he's writing from Ohio and also in Vermont saying, hey, is so-and-so doing well? Tell him I said hello, make sure that we're still part of the society here and we're not going away anytime soon. Really helping to push his son through some difficult times. And talking about these wildcats, talking about the investment. It's really interesting language. I wish I could get into a lot more of the detail, but it's not really easy to communicate unless you're reading through the letters and seeing it for yourself. So, but they're documenting the evolution of Houghton as the crash of '57 is happening. So they know that it's a dangerous time for investment and for lack of supplies, and maybe it's time to move on somewhere safer. They don't do that until about 1860, 1861. But in these letters, they're also referring to Stony Point when they talk about the town of Houghton. Just a show of hands, do many people recognize who Frederick Prentice is? He's a fairly important person in Washburn history, not just before Washburn, but after Washburn as well. He's a very scandalous person in local history as well. Probably in Ohio, I'm assuming, based on how his behavior was here. But just it's just really, like I said, it's really fascinating to read through the family letters, and I won't get into it too much tonight. But every once in a while in these letters, you get some really, really interesting details, such as the sketch Joel Allen writes, showing the progress of surveying the reservation as well as the different town sites. He has the Battle River Reservation now at Saxon Harbor. I'm assuming 2 is probably in here somewhere at Aldana. 3 is down here at Ashland Bayport area. There's 4 the town of Houghton, and then 5 is Bayfield, and then LaPointe on the island. And he's kind of describing the crash of Swamingham Bay after the 57 crash. Prentice has left, the men are leaving without money to pay the fare, times are getting worse all the time, and by next winter is dreaded by a good many who can scarcely live this summer. So, pretty desperate times. So, after all this, eventually Joel Allen leaves around 1860, 1861, and Guile, who had been mentoring him, guiding him through all this, he kind of disappears from the local picture. I mean, he was very powerful while all of this was going on. He was the father of the surveyors. He was the brother of a Wisconsin legislator who was also named Joel Allen Barber. And then Giles himself was elected to the Vermont House of Representatives. He had friends and family all around Vermont, the East Coast, along the Great Lakes, into Swamingham Bay area. So he had a lot of power and influence for that time, but he ultimately dropped out of the picture. However, the other guy that he was writing about, gossiping about in all of his letters, Frederick Prentice, he's deceased. He continued to be a prominent person in local history throughout the 1850s into the 1890s. He's known nationally as the first white person born at Toledo, Ohio, when it was still frontier country. He became an interpreter for traders and Indian nations throughout the Great Lakes, and especially in this area, he was very well known or infamous for Lake Superior land sale speculation. He had a paper town called Weequahdong on the west side of Ashland. We now notice to be Prentice Park. The Prentice Park of Ashland is named after Frederick Prentice. He was also an investor. I struggle how to explain this, but he was, for lack of better wording, an investor in the Chief Buffalo Square Mile that was supposed to be reserved in the city of Duluth under the 1854 treaty. There's a whole story and all these lawsuits about how he took the land from Chief Buffalo Benjamin Armstrong and was going to make money off of that. It's a whole other story. Most people here will either know him for the Prentice Brownstone Company. He was known as the King of Brownstone. You can still see the brownstone architecture in the city of Washburn with the brownstones from his quarries and throughout the Great Lakes, down in Chicago, down the East Coast, all that brownstone architecture. He wasn't the only brownstone investor, but he was a primary one. Without him, it would be a different industry. It would have been a different industry. And then you might also be familiar with the Peterbuck Lodge on Herman Island, where he went there with his second or third wife, I think, said a surprise, saying, hey, I have my work is build this beautiful lodge for you on Herman Island. And his wife looked at it and said, no way, we're going back out with you. So I just want to clarify, he wasn't the hermit of Herman Island. He came on decades after the real hermit had passed on. But if you know who Frederick Prentice is, you probably know him for one of the last 2 items here. So he's a very scandalous person, especially when you're reading about him in the letters, but ultimately he comes out on top, the Barbers not so much. The only other thing I want to say about Houghton Point is on some maps in the 1870s, the sawmill that the Barbers described in the 1850s eventually becomes named after McClellan. So it's not actually started by McClellan, it was already there, it was already part of the landscape, he just kind of took over it and it got named after him. If you're not sure where this is, it's the ravine or creek that's east of Memorial Park, between Houghton Point and Memorial Park. So with that being said, let's go a little further down the bay. Let's get to where the big city of Washburn is today. So before we get to Washburn, I want to explain something called the Talking Fish, also the Talking Trail or Council Creek Trail. And the Talking Trail refers to this trail network that would go from Fish Creek, get to the bottom of Swampton Bay, and then follow the lakeshore up to the west end of Washburn, and even all the way to Sioux River, maybe even all the way to Pike Creek. Depending on where you wanted to end up, you would take the Talking Fish Trail and end up on the lakeshore. It's actually called Talking Trail or Council Creek Trail, but on the oldest map that I can find with place names in this area, it's referred to as Talking Fish, which is probably a combination of Talking Trail and Fish Creek. Let's see. And it went to a very popular camping ground, which is still a popular camping ground, called the West End Park, over on the west end of Washburn. But we haven't gone that far down the lakeshore yet, so let's back up and go to the east end of Washburn. Well, this is just another map showing the Talking Fish River, also explaining the other alternate name, Council Creek Trail. And at the mouth of the creek, Council Creek Trail, later named Vanderventer Trail, today named Thompson Creek. There was once a large settlement, Indian village. Very important community at the time. But so if you see the name Talking Fish River, that's what it's referring to. It's actually referring to the Talking Trail that went from Talking Fish to the bay. And you can even see that Talking Fish, it's not down here now, it's actually going to Sioux River. Well, it's probably Vanderventer Creek right there. Let's see. So as you're walking down from McClellan's down the lakeshore to Memorial Park, you would have met the gentleman by the name of Antoine Gordon. Antoine Gordon was a mixed blood member of the Lake Superior Chippewa. He was married to Sarah Dingley, who was also a mixed blood member. They were very prominent families for that era and for that area as well. You can see that he had a cabin here right next to the Great Trail, so it was a very popular stopping point. And at the same time in 1858 that he bought that land on the east end of Washburn, he was also buying land at the far end of the trail where it ends up in Gordon, what we now call Gordon, Wisconsin. Gordon, Wisconsin is named after this gentleman, Antoine Gordon. So he had very important business investment at both ends of the trail. You could walk all the way from Gordon, all the way up here, and end up at his other house. This picture here, the Gordon store, this is actually in Gordon, Wisconsin. It was built by Antoine Gordon around 1858. It still is in Gordon today. I have actually been in that house. It's still owned by the Gordon family. His great-great-grandson was very kind and gave me a wonderful tour and showed me family photographs, and it was an excellent day of history. Gosh, it was really powerful to actually walk into the house that was built by Antoine Gordon way back when. So when you look at this cabin here on the map in Washburn, the east end of Washburn and Memorial Park, it probably looked a lot like this. Maybe even exactly the same. But he was a very powerful man at the time. He was still prominent in local history. Not all, but many of the Gordons that live in this area, Red Cliff area, Bellinger Settlement, they are descended from this gentleman here and his wife. As we walk down the lakeshore a little bit further, we would meet this guy named Captain Stephen Butterfield. He was originally from New York. He was a boat captain on the Swampton Bay area. He would, for hire, you could hire him to go take you from La Pointe to Aslan to deliver supplies. And he was married into the tribe. He was the husband of Mary Morrow, a mixed blood tribal member. And the thing I want to help communicate about this gentleman is that Washburn was originally called Butterfield after him. You can see on these maps from 1855 all through the 1860s and 1870s, it's Butterfield, 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 Butterfield. Gosh, what if Washburn was called Butterfield today? And Butterfield family never really went away. They still live here today. The Butterfield family of Radcliffe and the tribal communities in this area, they all descend from this family. So they're still around. They haven't gone anywhere. As we walk the other thing I should mention, that if you're interested in looking for Butterfield records, land records for the town of Butterfield, you're actually going to have to look for them in the Ashland County Registry of Deeds office, because Butterfield, this whole part of Bayfield County, was originally part of Ashland County when Ashland County was formed in 1860. And it remained part of Ashland County until 1866, when Ashland County kind of went bankrupt and then got joined back with LaPointe County, and then LaPointe County was split up in Bayfield County and Ashland County again. Eventually, Butterfield became part of that Bayfield County. But if you want to look for the original land records for that town, you're going to have to go next door over to Ashland. And it's not going to be an easy search because they don't index the land records for Bayfield County. You just have to go through those books page by page and find them. Let me know if you find anything. I'd be very interested. So as we walked down, we went through the east end of Washburn, we went through central Washburn, we're now at west end Washburn where the Great Trail ended up. And you would have met this guy named Peter Vandeventer. He was the husband of McBlood Caroline Mello, who was the sister of Mary Mello, who was the wife of Stephen Butterfield. So Vandeventers and Butterfields, they were pretty much the same family. They owned that whole side of the lakeshore. The central and western part of Washburn was owned by that family combined. He was someone that was known to be working in the grocery business at the time. Kind of an infamous liquor dealer, if you know what I mean. But regardless of what his occupation was, he was a very well-respected man at the time. And his family, again, is still around today. If you know the Vandeventers of Bad River and Redcliffe, it's that same family. They've been here for a long, long time, and they're not going away anytime soon. Those are kind of the original settlers of the Washburn city before it became Washburn. This gentleman here, James Smith Buck, he later became a historian in the city of Milwaukee. But during 1857, 1858, he had come up here from Milwaukee in order to work for the mining companies in the Pinocchios. And in his memoirs, he's describing this very dangerous trip that he took from LaPointe down to Ashland on a boat loaded with heavy equipment for the mining companies. Bad storm conditions, almost sinks. They would have died if it wasn't for Captain Butterfield sailing that boat. Not only does he mention Butterfield, he also mentions Gordon and Peter Vandeventer. So he's actually describing the whole community of people that lived here in Washburn at the time. It wasn't just one person living here at a certain time, another person living here at another time. It was a community. It was an actual living community of people and families that were here. And he captures all that in one interesting story. So that's the city of Washburn area. We're gonna kind of skip over a couple creeks as we go down the lake shore, and we're gonna stand up in Boyd Creek. I don't have anything against Bono Creek, it's just not part of my story today. We're gonna jump down to Boyd Creek instead, which is also part of the Talking Fish Network, because you would have to get from the bottom of the bay to the middle of the bay, and somewhere along there you would have gone by Boyd Creek. So it's just part of that, all part of that same trail network. It's just a different trailhead. So at Boyd Creek was a guy named Robert Dundas Boyd. He was the Register of Deeds for LaPointe County. He was also the clerk of court for a while. He moved here during the 1840s, married Julia Cadet, married into the tribe. He also had some influence outside of this area because he was the son of the Mackinac Indian agent and also the nephew of the President John Quincy Adams. So he had a lot of influence nationwide and also in this area. He was made into the tribe. The Boyd family is still very much around today. If you think of the Boyd family of Redcliffe, that's the same Boyd family that we're talking about here today. Chairwoman Nicole Boyd of Redcliffe is descended, her husband is descended from this family. He unfortunately passed away during a quarrel with another man, got shot during an argument. Not as scandalous as the murders I talked about before, but still an important murder that if it hadn't happened, maybe local history would look a lot different today. So Boyd Creek was named after him. You can see where his cabin was by the mouth of the creek. You can see the fields that he had cultivated. There's another little thing over here. And this is the outline of the city, the town, the paper town that he had proposed for this, this area, called Magnard. And that's named after Father Magnard from the 1600s. Who lived here for a while, then at the village that was here, he started going inland, following the trail network, and was never seen again. Some people believe this was probably the last place he lived. And this was the original trailhead for the Talking Fish River, where there was no village site here. By the time the 1800s came along, you could still see the well-beaten path, but the village itself was gone. So the village was not so much on the land, but now in the water, just washed away after centuries of storm. So archaeologists have been trying to find this town site, but they come to the conclusion, hey, it's probably gone. It's about 50 feet that way in the water. I just think that's fascinating, that there was a very prosperous village site here at one point, and it's now just totally washed away. We're going to start heading back up the trail network to the hills and to the barrens for our last stopping place tonight. Before, I was talking about the paper railroad that went from Sioux River, had an intersection up in the barrens, and you can go a couple different directions here. And some of the barter letters, they are referring to the railroad. There was a paper railroad, they were selling shares in it, making a lot of money off of that. When I say they, I mean Prentice and his business associate. But they had also had something called West Houghton, which is not in Houghton, but west of Houghton. And on other maps I've been able to find, it's actually called Aurora. And not only are there not only was there a paper town of Aurora and deeds for the town of Aurora, I've also found deeds for the Northern Wisconsin Bank that was located in the town of Aurora. And at one point there was over 80,000 currency notes in circulation. And you can still buy these currency notes online if you were savvy enough and you go online, you look for the Northern Wisconsin Bank that was in the town of Aurora. This $10 bill will sell for hundreds of dollars, upwards of $1,000 on online auctions. People buying this probably have no idea where Aurora was, but I've been able to piece together the puzzles to figure out, okay, there's a place called Aurora. It's actually shown on a map west of Houghton. I found the land records in the county deeds office, and it's still currency that's floating around. There may never have been a house or any kind of building in the town of Aurora. The paper bank may have only had currency, but you still have something tangible that you can hold on to today. So if anybody would like to donate a $10 note to me, I'd be forever thankful for you, and you'll be my new best friend. So, even if you don't give it to me, please let me know if you have one. It's just fascinating to me. This bank only lasted from 1857 through 1859 before it disbanded, but gosh, it's just amazing that you can still hold something like this in your hand today. The town of West Houghton and the town of Aurora, they never really manifested, but they continued to be known as Moose Lake, which is a stopping place, cabin along the trail about 5 miles southwest of Mount Valhalla. And at Mount Valhalla, you take the fork in the road and you would end up either at Pike River or at Sioux River. So Moose Lake is down here by the Superior Road, as it was called at one point. There's pine barrens here, pine barrens there. The people that ran the Moose Lake Station, they were, I believe Bill Herbert, if I'm not mistaken, he was a mixed blood member. I have to look into that a little bit further. But these are local guys from Bayfield, Superior, helping the tourists, helping roads, and coming to a comfortable place, helping them get along to the next destination. It's described as a pretty comfortable place, especially if it's 34 below zero outside. It's a lot safer inside. So that's my presentation for tonight. I want to circle back to the original thoughts I had on the board, where I hope after listening to this presentation tonight that you have a better idea of the ancient trail networks here, of the ancient village sites that were here, of the 1854 treaty lands, of the mixed blood families that lived here, and of the politics behind these paper towns before Washburn came around. So, thank you. I look forward to seeing you down the trail.
Thank you, Amorin. And if you have a question, it helps. We've got people way at the back wall, so even if you think you've got a strong voice, wait for me to get the microphone to you so that the people way back there can hear your question. Thank you.
So we heard many mentions of the name Houghton. And of course, we know of Houghton, Michigan, and the Keweenaw Peninsula, and around here as well. Can you offer any insight into what was the source of that name and where did it come from? I mean, we know Bayfield was a famous surveyor in all of Great Lakes.
Sure, yeah. So Douglas Houghton was a doctor, geology doctor that was very much involved during the copper boom of the 1840s. He was, I believe, the state geologist for Michigan at the time he had passed away. He died on Lake Superior during an expedition, during a bad storm. The boat crashed and he was never able to continue on after that. But I believe he was part of the 1820 cast expedition. I know he was part of some expeditions that came through this area. I don't know if he ever wrote about Houghton Point in his journals or in any of his literature. I know he's the namesake for Houghton Point, but I don't know why Frederick Prentice and his business partners decided to name Houghton Houghton. They named it after him, but whether they have a personal connection to him, I'm not really sure.
Thank you. More questions or comments? Yes.
Where did you find the land records for LaPointe County?
They actually depends on how far back you want to go. To find the oldest land record for anything in LaPointe County, I had to go to Mackinac Island, because at one point in time, LaPointe was part of Mackinac County. And then eventually it became part of Chippewa County. I've gone to Sault Ste. Marie, gone through that land office to find, looking for records. And then after that, it became part of Crawford County, so you have to go down to Prairie du Chien at the southwest corner of Wisconsin to look for those land records. And then you have to go to Stillwater, Minnesota, to look for St. Croix County land records when they were part of Wisconsin territory, and then eventually moved over to, not Stillwater, but Hudson, I believe. And then eventually it moved up to LaPointe, and eventually it moved to Bayfield, I believe, and now it's in Washburn. So if you want land records for anything after 1850, I think it's after 1851, I believe, you have to go to Washburn. The Registry of Deeds office. So it depends on what time period you're looking for.
Great question and a really amazing answer, right? Okay, any other questions?
Up front.
Yes. Here I come.
When this land was being promoted, like out on the East Coast,
by these three gentlemen that were out in Washington, D.C. and different parts of the country. Where did the people come from that bought that land? Is there a general flow from any part of the United States at that point that came into this area?
Well, at the time, this was the wild, wild Northwest. So you have the original 13 colonies, and then some of the newer states. Wisconsin was barely a state by that point, so people were generally coming from the East Coast. The way they got here before the Sioux Locks opened, before 1865, where they would either take a sailboat along the Great Lakes, or they would hike the Great Trail coming from St. Peter, from the St. Croix River area, St. Peter's and St. Paul. So it depends on which direction you wanted to come from. There was also another trail network that went from Lake Michigan across the Gogebic Mountains, to Flambeau Trail into Saxon Harbor area. After the Sioux Locks opened up in 1855, there was a boom of speculators coming in, of tourists, of investors, and they were generally taking the steamboats from Cleveland, from Toledo, from the Ohio area. A lot of the original settlers did come from either Ohio or New York. Not exclusively from those two places, but those are, from my review, those seem to be the most common origins that people came from.
More questions? Here we go.
Okay, when you talked about the Bad River Reservation, you showed the one up at the tip of Madeline and then where it is right now, and you mentioned something about Washburn. Was Washburn connected with that treaty, or did I misunderstand that?
I think you're talking about the reservation map that I showed, the Point of Rock map, that one?
Well, the tip of Madeline is part of the Bad River Reservation. Now, this is way back in the beginning. And you made a comment about Washburn. I was just wondering if Washburn had anything to do with that establishment on the tip of Madeline.
So I'm not sure I quite got the question. You're
Okay.
asking if Washburn is part of the treaty?
Yeah, did they have anything to do with it?
So at that time of the 1854 treaty, all of northern Wisconsin was ceded territory from the 1842 treaty. So technically it was, and still is, tribal land in that sense, that they have reserved usufructuary treaty right to the natural resources here. So it depends on what definition. It still is ceded territory. The tribes still do exercise treaty right throughout Washburn, throughout Swampscott Bay area, throughout northern Wisconsin. And then the 1854 treaty was designing specific reservations to have a permanent homeland to live on, not just to exercise treaty rights on, but to live on, to have a permanent homeland to never have to leave or be removed from the area. So yes, it was ceded territory. Apparently, in at least one version of the reservations that were being considered at the time, the Washburn area, or at least part of the Washburn area, apparently was a reservation at that time. That's the best answer I can give you. And then also there were the allotments here as well, under the 1854 treaty.
Okay. Here's another one that might be a little easier. A couple of the maps you showed on the tip of Madeline and Sand Island, there were two areas called factories.
Yeah,
What were those?
those are fur company factories. So they're not factories in the sense that we think of factories. They were, I forgot where I have the map now.
Well, Old La Point was down on the south end of the island.
This one. So factories. That's just the language that they used at the time to say this is the place where we process furs. So there's one on Old Fort of La Point on Madeline Island, and then there was another one across from it on Swallowing Point as well. Those are the main ones here. So that one, and then the one that's below it. Maybe there was another one at Coal Point or at the old meadow that the American Fur Company had on Sioux River.
And one small one, you talk about Prentice. Do you know if he did anything with lumber?
Yeah, I believe he did. I know he invested in it. I don't know if he had a company named specifically after him, but he became more famous for the brownstones. So
Yeah,
lumber was the 1870s and brownstones was 1880s, 1890s.
I grew up in Winona, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, and Prentice is a very prominent name there.
Okay, does not surprise me. That guy got around.
That's all I got.
More questions? Okay, good.
So at the very start, you talked about the Great Trail, and I would appreciate some comments about sort of the purpose and the longevity of that trail. Is that something that's sort of centuries old and was driven by Native Americans trading or intermixing or whatever was happening at that time?
So the trail network itself is thousands of years old. It goes back tens of thousands of years when the glaciers were melting, they were leaving behind sand deposits. The tribes were starting to move back into this area in order to take advantage of the game and the wildlife, the glacial lakes. And so as the ice drops, the sand stayed there. They continued to use that as kind of a super highway to get from over the Great Divide from the Mississippi River Basin into the Great Lakes Basin. So they continued to use
But what drove the movement of the people?
What's that?
I said, why did people move? I mean,
It just, at the time, it was just the way of life that they had. It wasn't just, you're not just staying on this square mile here for your entire life. You have this entire network of not only trails, but resources. So you may have a place where you're gonna go hunting. You're gonna have a place where you go gather berries. You're gonna have a place where you are farming corn. You're gonna have a place where you're fishing. They're not all in the same place. And if you stay in the same place too long, you're gonna deplete the resource. So it's not only where you're gathering resources, but you're also visiting your family, you're visiting your friends, you're trading. This whole network of societies, of different bands, of different families. And they knew the trail network, they knew each other, and they would get from point A to point B. Sometimes there were different politics that would require people to come up the Great Trail through the river and not hold a council. Maybe for war, maybe for resources, maybe for marriage. There's a lot of different reasons why people would take the trail. But at that time period, people did not stay in the same place for too long. And that's why we have the ceded territory, because the tribe knew they needed to have this vast expanse of land, of resources, in order to sustainably harvest them, in order to sustainably enjoy them for the next generations to come. So I hope that answers the question of why people would move around, not just for resources, but for social purposes as well, for political reasons. And if you're like me, if you have itchy feet, you never want to stay in the same place for too long.
The Indians were probably nomadic, weren't they, at that point? Still nomadic?
Sorry, I'm hearing a lot.
I say the Indians were probably somewhat nomadic yet, where they moved constantly.
Yep, I mean, they would have places they would come back to, the different village sites. They just wouldn't stay there all year long.
Thank you. I think we better stop right there before I know that's a long time to sit, but you've been such a great audience and had such great questions, and I appreciate you being here tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and I hope you join us for the last one of the series. And don't forget, this gentleman, Andrew Grimm, is one of our members, and he videotapes every presentation. And eventually, it takes a while, but eventually those are posted and are for your pleasure to view again at no charge on the Heritage Association website. So,
Mr. Grimm.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you once again, Mr. Amorin.